Okay, so we're going to go ahead and animate the layered content that we brought into After Effects in the last tutorial. So here you can see the layers as they were before. And if I just roll the playhead, you'll see that we have some simple animation going on and some fade outs. And some zooms and some panning. Okay, and this is very easy to do, and obviously this is just the tip of the iceberg with After Effects. You can do much more complicated things, but this is just an introductory tutorial. So the things that you see here you can apply to more complicated tasks. So each layer, if we look at the timeline here, has a drop down, and underneath that drop down we have what we call transform controls. So we can control the scale and the rotation and the opacity, etc, etc. And these work with these little things here called keyframes. Okay, so any animating in any program you want to do will require keyframes, and keyframes are really just a point in time at which something significant happens to the object. So if we look at this king layer here, if I just go to the beginning, you'll see I've got some keyframes here for opacity, scale and position. So what's happening is we're fading up from 0 opacity, so this keyframe here says opacity is 0, and then if we roll the playhead down to this point, you'll see that the opacity is 100. So start with 0, end with 100, and anything between that is called a tween. So After Effects will gradually kind of work out what the opacity should be, and then we go from 100 to 0 again on the last keyframe here. And similarly with scale, so here if I click this keyframe, you'll see we go from 7 to 100%, and the position goes from being position X just off the canvas to central. So that's very simple to do. So how do we do it? So I'm just going to show you with the opacity keyframes. So here if I just click on these and delete them, so now we have no opacity whatsoever throughout the clip. I can just roll back to the beginning. To put in a keyframe, the first one, we can just click this little stopwatch here, which is next to opacity. There are a number of ways you can put keyframes in. This is just the way I do it. So put that in and keep it at 0, and then roll the playhead down to a point at which you want the opacity to be 100%. So I want it to be basically 100% when the size of the image is just about full, so about here. We don't have to put another keyframe in, we can just roll the playhead and then scrub to 100. And After Effects will automatically put the keyframe in, scrub it up to 100, and then it will stay there. And then basically I'd like to go from 100 back down again. So if I put a keyframe in and it goes down, it will slowly go down from this point, which isn't what I want. So I need to put a new keyframe in that keeps it at 100, so I can just right click the opacity label and add keyframe, and then my fade out can be as I did before. So at this point where I'm getting the new image on top, which looks quite nice, I can just fade not quite to 0, but maybe to 15%, and then I've got like a cross dissolve, and away we go. So each layer has a drop down. So if I look at the layer above, this one, you can see the same transform controls for each layer, same process for putting in keyframes, and away you go. Okay, so and then you can just tuck them away. There are shortcuts for doing just certain things. So if I select the king layer and I just want to do a position adjustment, I can just press P on the keyboard and you'll see position appears. Equally, if I want to do opacity, it's T for transparency, so you can just press T and the opacity control, transform control appears. So that's very easy, so you don't have to keep going through and twirling down these menus. Now the final thing is this layer here You can see I've got a crowd scene and then a pan. You can do this with scale and panning, and this is what we call the Ken Burns effect. So Ken Burns is a kind of guy in the 70s who perfected the art of animating with stills. So these sorts of things that we're doing are called the Ken Burns effect. Okay, so once I've done that, I can then start to add other bits and pieces from my project bin. So I've just got a more exciting example here, if you like, which shows you what you can do. So here I've just got, you'll notice in my layers palette, I've got multiple layers, copies of the king layer. That's very easy. So if you just highlight a layer, Command C and Command V, it'll make a copy for you. If you've got existing keyframe data on the copied layer and you paste it, it'll keep that data, so you'll have two animated layers, which is handy. And in this one I've got some kind of layering of images that goes on, and then an overlay. So one thing I forgot to mention here is the staggered timeline. So you'll remember from the first tutorial when we had After Effects open, everything looked like this. It was a complete solid. You can quite quickly stagger how content appears in After Effects by just moving these content blocks. So anything that's a solid shows you where the content is. And you can also adjust very quickly the time that appears on the canvas for by just dragging the edges. So that's very useful for quickly laying stuff out. The only thing is, if you have something that you want to appear later on, you can't then put a bit in there. So you can either do two things. You can copy a layer and redo it later, so have that content appear later on as a separate layer, or you can just keep the content visible on the timeline, but then work with the opacity to make it appear and disappear. And quite quickly you'll realize that there are issues to do with layers. So very often we'll duplicate a layer. So if you wanted content to appear behind and then in front, you would obviously need two layers to do that. So there's a couple of things going on here which you just need to be aware of. So here, I just turn this layer off here, you can see I've got some kind of overlay. So I've got a red issue going, red video issue going on at the back there, and then the layered documents on top. And so here I've got a video, which is this Moody Wash video. So if I double click that, you can preview it in the viewer. And to put that in, obviously, and this is the great thing about After Effects, you can mix these things. So if I just delete this layer, I can just drag from the bin down to where I want it on the timeline, so at the bottom. And then I can resize. So if I just click one of these handles and hold down Shift, I can resize that content so that it is the right size for what I need. And you'll notice there's a sort of beginning part here where I've got some yellowing that I'm not too keen on. So I can then just get to a point where it's predominantly red, so I can just shorten that part of the timeline so that just red appears, and then I get this kind of red overlay. Now to get the overlay, it's just like you would in it's a layer mode, just like you get in Photoshop. So here you'll see in my timeline, I've got some modes and then overlay and hard light. So those are just like overlay modes layer modes that you get in Photoshop. But you may not necessarily see them in your timeline. So if you first open After Effects, your timeline will look like this. You have layer name, parent, and there aren't that many options here. But if you look right at the bottom left here, very difficult to see, but you've got three little buttons. So if you press each of those, you'll see that you get extra options in your timeline. So one is for in and out. This one here is for transfer controls, so you get layer mode and tracking maps if you push this circle and square button, and then the other one is layer switches, which we don't really need to use. So for our purposes, we're going to use this one here, which is transfer controls. Once you've got that open, you can then go onto your layers. So in this one I just used hard light for one layer and then overlay for another. And if I just turn those off, you can see how they look before. So this is the beauty of After Effects, and this is why it's called compositing. So you can basically start to push images together and make them seem like they're part of one layer.